Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Ford Foundation Center for Social Justice on this very special occasion when I am honored to have my brother Rashid Johnson in the house on the occasion of the publication. Thank you to Keith Fox and everyone at Fiden for this fabulous publication of so many of your great works, not nearly as many as you could have had given the thousands of brilliant works, but this is so extraordinarily curated. But while Rashid needs no introduction, I do want to say a few things because Rashid is someone whose work I have always admired, and the ways in which you, on your journey as an artist, have manifest your creativity, your experience, your identity, the materiality, the interiority, the way in which your development as an artist has been just a phenomenal thing to witness. And so here you are at the top of your game. You are Rashid Johnson, who is revered, admired, collected by the world's greatest museums, the most prominent and influential collectors. I look from the Met, their acquisition that I want to talk about in a moment, a major work, body of work that they have acquired. But the other day, during Thanksgiving, going through Architectural Digest, and there's a big old Rashid in this Paris apartment. I just think, my goodness, what black man is everywhere you are? I mean, this is amazing. So let's talk about Rashid and how I often, when I encounter rare and extraordinary talent, I ask the question, have you become the person, the artist you dreamt you would be? I mean, are you living the dream of Rashid the artist?
Wow. Really, thank you for the introduction. Thanks for the invite. It's great to be here with all you guys. That was a hell of an introduction. And it's a really, really big question. And I was thinking about it even today when I was driving up with my studio director, Alex, and we were talking about some projects that I have coming up and things that I'm working towards. And I thought to myself briefly, and it's always brief when you think this way, maybe I have become what I was hoping to be. And by that, I don't mean having accomplished the things that I've accomplished. This has nothing to do with acquiring resources. This has nothing to do with getting certain kinds of attentions. And it has a lot to do with the idea of freedom. Because what I really realized at one stage, or one moment, was that what I really, really aspired to as an artist was the opportunity to have autonomy in the way that I projected my voice and amplified my voice. And to some degree, and the resources don't hurt in this opportunity, I've accomplished the ability to feel in many ways quite free in my relationship to my practice and the evolution of my practice and how I kind of conjure ideas and think about what the next steps are. So to some degree, yes, in others I still have a lot that I want to continue to do. And really, and I'll say this, I always think about, as an artist, being really capable of capturing the moment that you're in. So you can't really zoom ahead. I have work to make as somebody who's in their early 50s. I'm in my late 40s now. I have work to make as somebody who's in their early 60s. I have work to make against the backdrop of a time that we have yet to experience. So I haven't accomplished all I want to accomplish because I haven't lived all of the time that I want to speak towards.
And I appreciate your, I think, your candor about the resources and ambition. One of the things I find is particularly not just artists, people of color, women, the notion of I'm ambitious for my work is almost, people resist that idea. And one of the things, I've known you a long time, you're ambitious as an artist. And I think that's to be celebrated. But I also know that the pressure that you face, that comes with success, and the desire for autonomy and agency often feels compromised. I mean, and I talk to artists, visual artists. I've had this conversation with creative, with Ava DuVernay, who has gone off and started this independent film company because she said, I want to be, yes, I'm the most powerful black woman in Hollywood, but I'm not free. I have to make movies and listen to these 5 people tell me, no, take that out, put that in, don't, and I'm producing something that's not authentically me. And which I think we will see when Origin, which is the first film that she is fully in control of. As an artist, you're part of an ecosystem that is at its core commercial. And that for many artists, for many leaders in the arts community, I'm sure our dear friend Thelma Golden would attest, can be really corrupting in some ways. And we have seen artists, great artists, become corrupted. I mean, we've seen artists who are intoxicated by the success, who become, because the dealer is saying, no, these collectors want more of this, do less of that. How do you, because you've been able to navigate this with real agility, how do you navigate that?
No, it's a good question, and it is complicated. And I know I really didn't imagine we were going to be this honest today. So.
Oh, you're at the Ford Foundation with me.
Apparently, we're telling real truths here.
We only do keep it real here at the Ford Foundation. So no, we're not going to have one of those academic, you're at the Whitney conversation with a curator. No, we don't roll like that in the Ford Foundation.
I can't retreat into art speak and critical.
They gave me a whole bunch of talking points with the art speak from the curator, which I.
No, look, this is a really interesting thing to think about, and anybody who had the bingo chip that I was going to make a reference to John Bon Jovi, you win. But I actually met John Bon Jovi recently. He was in my studio and we were talking, and I said, "Are you still performing?" He said, "You know what? I've had an issue with my voice recently, and I'm only interested in performing if I can do it in the way that I want to do it. Like I do it with real clarity, real quality." And he said to me at that point, he said, "I'm not a whore for the applause." And I think you find this oftentimes with the best artists. And unfortunately, I'm going to include myself in that group as I continue.
I think we all would include you in that group.
But I think what you often find is someone who's, in speaking to this idea that you suggested of ambition, whose ambition it is to fulfill something that does not only feel satisfied through the acceptance of others. So as much as I appreciate and as much as I aspire to, and in so many ways for my audience to be satisfied by the things that I'm discussing and producing and amplifying, I don't need it maybe as much as you think I do, really. The thing that I really, really need to do is make sure that my vision is captured. Now, to your point about resources, I am very, very lucky that the thing that I love to do and the thing that brings me satisfaction also brings me financial
Success and
return
money.
and opportunity.
Which you deserve. I
Yeah.
mean, I think this is
I do, and I tell my wife,
who is fabulous. We love us some Sherry. Yes.
yeah, Sherry's like amazing. She sometimes struggles. She says, "I feel like we don't deserve all this," and I'm like, "For shit, sure we do,
Hello.
because we worked for it, right?" And I feel zero shame, not even the slightest bit. And Thelma knows this, and Alex knows this, and Christopher knows this. I'm the first one to brag about the things that I'm able to have brought to fruition. But I'm also really, and I say this in the most genuine way, most satisfied by the fact that my vision has genuinely not been compromised. Now, I was speaking with an artist earlier, a young guy whose work does not necessarily bring back certain kinds of financial return because of the way that his work functions. And he said, how do I do the thing I want to do? And then, I make these other paintings, but I don't get any satisfaction from them. And I'm like, that is a real conundrum. That is a real conundrum. That is really, really a complicated question. And as much as I, believe in certain kinds of integrity as far as your approach, you also have to be in life nimble. Like I always, I tell my son, if I were in real estate or if I were a garbage man, I promise you, I would try to be the best garbage man. And I would make being a garbage man, like, you would all sit here and believe today that that was my goal the whole time. Was to do that job, because you have to embody where you are. You have to look at what it is you are kind of, some people would imagine, mired in. And you have to say, no, I'm turning this thing into something that you would never expect it to be. And that's really how I think about the world. I just happen to be an artist, and it happens to be the thing that satisfied me, and it happens to be the thing that brings me joy. Had I not been successful in this, I promise you, I would have been successful in whatever it was I did, and I would have celebrated whatever it was that I did. And that's just how I think. That's just what success is for me. It's not about specific kind of accomplishments. It's about realizing that accomplishment is itself the goal.
And do you attribute this to, you mean, because your parents, well, your mother was a prominent historian, and I mean, for some of us who, come from, little shotgun houses on dirt roads, we have a story. But
I saw your 60 Minutes.
Yeah, no. I'm gonna get you for so how do you situate your arc and your because I've read some of your interviews where you talk about you have anxiety. There's anxiety that you're expressing a lot, but there's also some confidence that clearly comes from somewhere. And is that your parents? Is that your upbringing?
Yeah, I imagine it has a lot to do with it. I think my parents really did kind of instill in us that, my brother, myself, and my sister, that, we had, that they'd sacrificed. Like, it's not untraditional for black parents to remind you consistently of all that they have done for you in order for you to have the opportunities that you have. And my mother was a professor at Northwestern. My father had, this kind of small electronics business. He was into community band radio. We lived in a little kind of townhouse. Mm-hmm. When I was young, we were, my mother was just finishing her PhD, so we struggled as anyone would in that scenario. And I often joke that by the time I turned 13, my parents were both like very invested in kind of what I guess would have been like the third wave of Afrocentrism. So I grew up around, folks in dashikis, afros, all of the kind of signifiers of that kind of moment. By the time I turned about 13, my mom had become full professor, so she bought a Saab. And there goes the afro. you know, the dashiki's gone. I felt like I was abandoned in Afrocentric. Like I was raised in that space, almost as if it was a religious space. And it's like if a Jewish boy turns 13 and then his parents are like, yeah, we're not Jews anymore. Just move on from that whole position. So, you know, I feel like I've had these kind of multiple identities, and sometimes my work kind of explores that, and it's something that's really essential to my thinking. But yeah, I mean, my parents didn't celebrate us the way that I think some folks celebrate their children. They had expectations, and my brother fulfilled them as having gone to Amherst and Harvard, and then came me, and it was not such an Amherst-Harvard story for me. It was more of a strain and a struggle. I was a tougher kid. I got involved in a lot more kind of complicated positions than my brother had. And you know, I grew up in Evanston, which is you know, close to Howard Street, which was called the Jungle at the time. So, you know, you had a choice. You could either, you know, take the red pill or the blue pill for my position. And I took the blue pill, and that brought me a lot of brought my parents a lot of complicated experience and pain. But you know, as I kind of moved forward and found my footing, you know, I realized what it was I loved to do. And when I could put my energy towards something that I really love to do, then that's when I kind of started to find my voice more.
Right, and I think like many artists, the journey is often very messy. And as you describe, the more traditional journey of Amherst and Harvard, which is a more linear and normative way of progressing through life and developing. And for artists, it's just complicated in other ways, because artists are often just more complicated people. Can you talk about the other inspirations, the people who, I mean, and I think about you, and you've written and talked about Sam Gilliam, for example, and also Richard Pryor. I mean, there's a whole range here for you of people who have inspired you in different ways, and I'd love for you to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really an index of references and people and things that have just kind of pointed me in positive directions, whether it's Toni Morrison or Dave Chappelle or Richard Pryor. You know, what comedians are my favorite, because I think that
Why are comedians your favorite?
it's just the most difficult art form. I mean, with my work, you know, you can see it and you could cry, you could laugh, you could cuss me out, you could tell me you love me. All of these are appropriate responses. With a comedian, if you don't laugh, they failed, right? And I love that kind of singular position and that the effort that goes into it. Like you talked about this idea of being ambitious. Comedians they're so effort driven. And I think it's okay for artists to be invested in effort and to aspire to something, to want something. I think a big part of what it is we do is we say, please just look at what I did. You know, please just look at what I have to say. It's just a little bit different than what you thought you knew. And that is that's about longing, that's about aspiring, that's about love, it's about empathy, it's about all those things. But my catalog for references is exhausting. Sam Gilliam, who is a painter and one of my heroes. I was talking with Thelma earlier about the work of Bob Thompson, who's a painter and hero of mine, and kind of coming across his work and seeing somebody who had done something that, you know, was so brilliant and so beautiful and so unexpected, because Thompson's work and the way that he depicted bodies, right? He really stayed away from certain kinds of representation. The black characters weren't black; people were green and yellow and blue, and the bodies were different, and they were outside. And I always make this reference to Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, when she says, early in the book, she says something about there's a difference between being put out and being put outside. If you get put out, you can come back in. if you're put outside, it's a permanent condition. And I love that Thompson's work is this exploration of the outside and how complicated outsideness in America has been to black folks. Like when I was growing up, I grew up, in an urban space. The idea of landscape and the outside was the most complicated thing in the world. I remember friends of mine who like moved to Colorado after high school, and I was like, I can't do that. I can't occupy that space, right? Like I don't know, there's this paranoia or this fear of what it is, you can kind of belong to in those situations.
But it's interesting that and this gets me back to comments that I've read where you talk about anxiety and confidence. I mean, which is hard for me to imagine. I mean, many comedians will tell you that they are desperately insecure people and lack confidence, and yet they are called to do this work of potentially humiliating themselves night after night and just going back for more. But as an artist, Rasheed, it's hard for me to imagine you as lacking confidence. I mean, your work is so powerful. And I mean, I have this conversation with Mark Bradford about Mark as a black queer man and me as a black queer man, and we have these conversations about how within this identity and expectation to project confidence, which of course Mark Bradford projects a lot of confidence.
Absolutely.
Just as literally as he is like, fixing some lady's hair with an old-fashioned like hair burner. But to me, I mean, it's you, and again, I'm not trying to turn into your therapist here, but there is a real level of confidence. I mean, that the 2002 or 2003 piece that you did, the homage to Sanford Biggers, sorry, to Barclay Hendricks. I'm sorry. Have y'all seen this? Is that confidence? I mean, you gotta have confidence. And I find that so much of your work, part of it that pulls you in is you have clarity about what your practice is, how to take what's in your head and put it in whatever material, whatever medium, and to feel that you've achieved what you wanted to do with that work.
I've always felt like I serve at the behest of the work. I really do. And when Darren talks about anxiety has been a big part of my story. Fear is a big part of my story. And it's, in some ways has served me. In other ways, it's difficult. I think a lot of folks here, I don't know how many people are on Lexapro. I was going to ask for a show of hands, but it felt maybe a little intrusive. But it's just, it's something that maybe I come by honestly. But I would never choose, for instance, to come do this talk. And I know I seem like I'm okay up here. And actually, to be completely honest, I'm fine, because you guys seem warm. But I do these kinds of things, or I'm open to and willing to amplify my voice because I know that it serves the work. Like I wouldn't choose it for myself necessarily, because my choice is I'm quite introverted in a lot of ways. I'm a homebody. I kind of just want to be at home. I don't love parties. I'm a recovering alcoholic. So it's kind of one of those things where I oftentimes, given the choice, choose to kind of huddle in. I have a small group of friends and community. I'm gregarious. I like people.
Are you? But in some ways, maybe you're like what people call a learned extrovert. I mean, because no one who knows you or no one who encounters you would encounter you as an introverted person.
Yeah, and it's in my kind of gregarious nature it's honest. I feel like it's all sincere. It just comes down to what I would choose to do more than anything else. And given my druthers, given a choice, I like quiet And I read this book by a guy named Kevin Quashie, brilliant academic who's at Brown now, and it's you want to take a note, it's called The Sovereignty of Quiet. And it talks about the idea of black publicness, that blackness is this inherently kind of public condition, and it's a public condition in that our expectations for it are quite specific. We know what it's resisting. We know its aspiration to resist. We know how it functions. We know what it's scared of. We know what it dislikes, what it hates. But that all of that kind of publicness comes at the expense of what he references as quiet, which is the interior kind of narrative, the opportunity to be anonymous, to have that autonomy that I spoke of earlier and that Darren referenced. And so, that kind of opportunity or that thought or that chance for quiet or for a kind of public-facing experience is really what my nature kind of gravitates towards. So, it's not a lack of confidence, the anxiety. It's just an interest in exploring things in a less public way.
I want to pivot to something that has really impressed a lot of people in the art world, and that is the way you collaborate with other artists, and most notably, the way you collaborated in acquiring Nina Simone's childhood home. I mean, you and Julie Moretu and Adam Pendleton, and I don't know who else was, but there's a whole group of
Ellen
you.
Gallagher.
Ellen, yep, a whole group of you. Why did you need to buy Nina Simone's house?
It was an opportunity. In all honesty, for me, it goes back to the first trip that I took to Ghana. I went to Ghana when I was 19. My mother's an African history professor, so there were a couple of opportunities I had to travel to Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, when I was younger. And when I went for the first time on my own, I was 19, and I visited the expatriated home of the scholar W.B. Du Bois. And I remember kind of walking into that house, and in the house there were Persian rugs and all of these philosophers' books, things that I was reading, whether it was like Descartes, like all the Germans. And so, and they were in German, and I remember I loved that. And I was like, did he, and apparently he'd learned German because they hadn't translated so much of those philosophers' work to English at that time. And so I remember falling in love with that space, and it brought me so close to him. And from that, I read Souls of Black Folks, and I started kind of digging into some of his thinking. And I remember just understanding the value of place at that moment, and a place to kind of visit, a place to kind of conjure and to buoy and to amplify, the concerns and ideas that live in some of our important historical figures. And so when the idea of Nina's house arose, and it was actually through a curator at the Museum of Modern Art who wrote me and Adam Pendleton and said, oh, you know what, Nina Simone's childhood home is likely to be destroyed. Do you know anybody who could help save it? And then Adam and I spoke, and we said, we got to find some other people because this is going to cost some money. And so we called Julie and we called Ellen, and like Adam tells it, they just said yes. And there was so much power in that yes. And it felt like this team that we were like forming, like Voltron, to kind of buoy and to save and to amplify the voice of this incredible historic talent. And so we were able to acquire that house, and then we've gone through this whole process of making it a historical site and raising money for it. But I really feel like we have this opportunity over and over again to again kind of make sure that we're rebuilding a canon, and that canons which have historically failed disenfranchised folks. Canons have been an incredible obstacle. Like I was telling Thelma earlier, chronology is oftentimes an obstacle to Black art. It's Thelma in 1993 curates the show Black Male. It introduces me to the work of Glenn Ligon and Gary Simmons and a number of other artists. 1998, she curates the work of Bob Thompson. Bob Thompson is making paintings in 1960, right? Before Glenn's making paintings, so how the hell, when we use art history as this incredible vehicle, am I meeting Bob Thompson after I've met these other artists? I mean, we all know how Western history functions, how effective it is at telling us that the Greeks inspired the Romans, right? That Velázquez brings us Goya, right? That Pollock is born of the burden of modernism that Picasso gave him, right? But you can't tell me that Bob Thompson comes before Glenn Ligon. This is a dark interruption. This is a real moment to explore how chronology and how art history oftentimes fails to effectively capture and to understand, in this particular case, how Black folks have created and contributed to the critical discourse.
I mean, I think you're being generous. I think the effort to ignore, erase, to just be indifferent
Absolutely.
to Black excellence. And so it's not as if the canon has been informed by a pursuit of excellence. It's been informed
Pursuit
by
of erasure.
right.
Yeah.
And that there is both excellence and erasure of excellence happening at the same time.
Absolutely. And so, you know, having been given the platform that I have, it's been really at the heart of my practice to really amplify the voices of the artists who came not only after me, but before me, because it proves the value of my existence. Right. If you don't know about the work of Sam Gilliam, then I feel shame that you know about my work, right? Because I'm born of the work of Sam Gilliam and Robert Colescott and Bob Thompson and Ed Clark and the laundry list of other folks who really inspired, inform, and influence how my practice functions. So if I don't put my foot down and say, you need to be aware of these antecedents, then it's as if I'm making myself into a ghost. And to Darren's point, I've got too much confidence for that shit. Yeah.
So as we begin to wind down, before we get to questions, I want you to talk about the book, which is just extraordinary. And of course, everyone who comes to a Ford Foundation Book Talk gets a free book when you go home. And so I think we would all love to hear about just the process, because often these books get presented and they're pretty, and we're going through them going, wow, this is amazing, this is amazing. A lot of work went into this. And for you, the artist, it is often traumatizing to actually work with the editorial team and the publishing house to get something like this done. So talk about that and how it has been for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, books are hard. Books have been, for me, so challenging. I just don't have the book brain. But I really do, in a sincere way, I really love this book. And partially, you know, the success of this book is born of the formula that Phaidon has produced to create these artist series books. I grew up on these books. I mean, I've always wanted to have one of these books. This always felt like a graduation or a real kind of recognition once you got one of these, when you got to be in the annals of this kind of story, this developed discourse, this dialogue that has so effectively predicted the artists who are changing and creating the art canon as we understand it today. So that's really something that's so special to me, to have been invited by Keith to do this. So thank you, Keith. And having had the assistance of everyone who worked on the book with me, who really just kind of carried me. Books are hard, but they're hardest on people who have to make them, and that's often not the artist, right? So that's Alex Ernst, who works with me, and Angelique Miranda, who works with me, who's here as well, and Ernesto, who's with us. Is he with us? I don't know. But either way, it's an interesting thing. I wanted to bring this up because it's so strange that I've kind of gotten to this space in my career where I feel like, to some degree, I'm in the middle. And in the art world, we call it, what do they call it? What do they call this? Mid-career. I don't. It's as if I don't even want to use the words or whatever. And there's really no other profession that you get to the middle, and then they just tell you to like show all of your stuff. They're like, tell us everything that you did. You got to the middle. Like most people get to the middle, and some guys buy a sports car. Some women get a little plastic surgery. For artists, we're kind of forced at this stage to tell you what happened, on the first half. And that's a complicated thing to do because you have to make a lot of choices. And like they say in film, you have to kill a lot of babies, You got to kill a lot of babies in the course of telling people who you are. And these books force you to do that kind of heavy examination. And I'm really proud that that I was able to weather it and to kind of effectively make something that I could be happy with and proud of, especially with how consequential it is when you get to this middle stage.
Well, it's a real triumph, and you are absolutely in the team to be congratulated. But speaking of triumphs, there is a work that is most prominently featured, The Broken Five, which is quite extraordinary, and it's been acquired by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And it's monumental in its scale. To talk about The Broken Five and what that represents and why you felt compelled to create this work.
Yeah, The Broken Five is a part of a body of work that I call Broken Men. And Broken Men came as a kind of graduation on the body of work that predated it, which I called Anxious Men, which is this kind of examination of not only my own anxiety, but in a lot of ways the collective anxiety that I think so many of us share against any number of backdrops, whether at the time of me having started that body of work, I was, like I mentioned earlier, I was getting sober and I was trying to understand how I was going to experience life without the assistance of alcohol and drugs. You had quite a bit of, at the time when I'm making this work and continues sadly to this day, interventions or experiences between black men and the police. And for this particular work, it's been suggested that this group of kind of five figures that live now at the Metropolitan Museum, which was a real point of pride for me. I took my son to see that work as it was installed, because having something at the Met in some ways just felt really, quite special. No more special than having something at Studio Museum in Harlem, or at the Guggenheim, or any of the other incredible institutions that New York has for us. But it serves in that kind of, in that tier of opportunities. But it was kind of suggested that those five characters were an interesting stand-in or representation for the five young men who were accused of rape in Central Park, and then
The Central Park Five.
Yeah, exactly. Who were then later incarcerated and discovered to have been innocent of the crime. So, my work attempts at times to capture prescient moments. It doesn't exclude other moments. Its ambition is to be, in some ways, invested in a timelessness. But there are also moments where you see the opportunity to kind of capture and illustrate a moment or an event or something that is or has affected your thinking. And in this particular case, you know, there have been a lot of folks who've suggested that that work is a way of kind of capturing some of the sentiment and some of the kind of tragedy that was experienced by those five men who were so unfairly treated.
So final question, I want to return to the first time I encountered Rashid Johnson's work. It was, of course, at Freestyle. And I want to, obviously, Freestyle was sort of Thelma Golden's brainchild of this sort of series of presentations of new art. Talk about that experience and what appears to an outsider to be a sort of an affinity that many of you who were part of the F series of those shows that Thelma curated have among you. So was for you, like for Mark and so many others, that like a breakthrough show?
Oh,
what happened? Why?
It was the breakthrough show. There still continues to be a fraternity of us who really look to each other from those exhibitions. And you have to remember at the time that Freestyle happens in 2001, this very much predates all of the enthusiasm that currently seems to be in the commercial space for the work of Black artists. It just, it wasn't that kind of party at the time. There were very few of us at galleries. There were very few of us making substantive returns for our labor as artists. And this opportunity just provided us community. And it provided us community in a way that I couldn't have ever expected. And I continue to have such strong relationships with so many artists and curators who I met from that experience. You know, personally, it was one of the most rewarding things that ever happened to me, and partially, and I'll be really honest now, because it made me realize I wasn't ready. You know, I was kind of cast. I was making these photographs, and they were really effective in the story that they told. But when I went to see that show, I realized that a lot of the people in that show were just better artists than me at that particular moment. I was like, wow, look at the rigor, look at the ambition, look at the complexity and the density of some of these practices. People like Mark Bradford, people like Eric Wesley, people like Sanford Biggers. And, you know, I remember looking at their projects, and granted, I was by far the youngest artist in that show. I believe I was 21, so I was kind of like also the child of that show. But what I really learned was I had some work to do, you know? And I literally went back to Chicago because I was like the only person who was from the Midwest in that show. And I said, you know, I have to work harder. I have to push this thing. I have a lot that I want to explore and understand. So it was really an opportunity for me to learn. I went back to grad school after that. Like, even though I had gotten such positive attention, you know, I really took the lesson that I had more growth. And for that reason, I'm so proud to have been a part of that history and that moment and that opportunity. But I'm also so rewarded by the fact that it taught me that I had a lot more to learn.
So if there are any questions, you can approach either side of the room. We have time for a couple of questions. And I want to ask you, as we come close to an end, it was Thanksgiving last week.
It was.
What does Rashid Johnson give thanks for?
I said to my son, because we have a tradition where we go around the table, and I'm sure most of you probably have this same tradition, and we say, what we're thankful for. And as I started my kind of thanks, I said to my son in front of everyone, I said, what's the most important thing in the world? And he said, love. And the thing that I was most thankful for is that I'm here to teach him that lesson. It may sound like really low-hanging fruit, but I really, really fundamentally believe that love is the answer. And you can spin it whatever way you want, but the fact that we still have access to it and it's something that we can employ is at the center of what I'm thankful for every day. So I'm really thankful for the capacity and the ability and the willingness to employ love.
Yes, please.
Hello. I just wanted to make a comment just before I ask the question, and that I loved your comment about you have work yet to create amongst a backdrop that is yet to exist, because it reminded me of the Maya Angelou quote about the day, about loving the day because she hasn't seen this one before, you know? So I love that hope. I'm an architect, so this is a question based on that kind of point of reference. You know, the work, like the body of work from the new museum, you know, overtly architectural, you know? So then it was about this kind of art with this kind of adjacency to architecture. And then now there's the work, there's the piece at the Whitney now, right? Mm-hmm. So where that piece that alluded to architecture is firmly functioning as an architectural element, adjacent to and within this important piece of architecture. So I was just wondering about, how you look at that work at the Whitney versus that work that was in the new museum and in other places before that.
No, it's a good question. You know, those works obviously share so many characteristics. They're both these kind of, I think, was one scrolling behind? Yeah, so it's this armature of steel grids, and the grid is really so essential to my work. My father was into the sciences. We didn't have drawing paper in my house. We had gridded paper, so I only know how to draw using the grid, right? So it's like, part of it is quite formulaic.
It's all starting to make sense now.
Yeah, and it really does. It really does. And the other kind of anecdote that I often like to share around these particular works is, you know, I spent some time at different stages really invested in looking at the work of artists like Donald Judd and Sol LeWitt, and you could see the influence of their work in these particular works, especially kind of the grid and that dynamic of kind of something, an armature that kind of rises from the ground into kind of a vertical structure. But in having visited the work of someone like Donald Judd in a place like Marfa, Texas, and Chinyati, where he keeps his foundation, the experience is quite interesting in that they take you out to see the work of Judd, and anybody who's familiar with Judd's structures knows that you can kind of aspire to enter them, right? You kind of almost want to be in them, or you want to occupy them, and they advise you, please do not stand in or on top of or inside of the Donald Judds. And so as soon as the tour guide leaves, everybody gets in on top of the Donald Judds, right? And so part of what my ambition is in these works is this idea of kind of occupying that space. Like, if I'm given the opportunity to author a certain space, what lives inside of it, right? And for me, that's a lot of the signifiers and the materials and the histories that inhabit my thinking, whether that's shea butter, which is a West African product, our black soap, our books by Amiri Baraka, plants, which kind of serve to like provide space for empathy, because everyone who comes to see one of these works demands to the museum or the institution that's holding the work to know how the plants are going to be taken care of. And I often joke, it's like, they will step over a homeless man outside and they'll be like, who's going to water these plants, right? But this idea of empathy, when it's born into these spaces, when someone comes into the space and they say, I'm here to care, and then they get an answer that's hopefully satisfactory to them. But the care is still there. So maybe you just walk around the museum caring at that point. And so that opportunity to kind of create space for empathy, right? So it's like I can employ empathy. I can kind of, I used to go to the MCA Chicago when I was young, and there was a sculpture by Carl Andre, and it was steel planks on the floor. And a lot of people didn't know that you could stand on the steel planks. But me and my friends, we caught wind that you could stand on the steel planks. And so we go to the steel planks, and we use it as a breakdance mat. And I remember thinking, I still think to this day, Carl Andre could not have thought that these black kids were going to come into the museum and use this thing as a breakdance mat. So the opportunity to kind of inhabit, to live inside, to employ, to invest in, and to become part of a hard historical discourse through your own activation is really at the center of those works for me.
Thank you. Final question.
Thank you, Darren. Oops, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you, Darren. Thank you, Rashid, for an inspirational evening. I have a mundane question. As the mother of black men, are your parents still alive?
They are. My parents are alive and well. I spent Thanksgiving with my father. My mother spent it with my brother. We divvied up the parents. I hope to have them for a long time. They are both fantastic people who've taught me endless lessons. My mother raised a son who's a lawyer, who's done quite well, me who's trying my best, and my sister who's currently a graduate student at the Art Institute of Chicago, and she's an amazing woman for what it is she's been able to accomplish, coming from quite modest beginning of her own, and my father the same. So I'm so rewarded to have them in my life. It's really one of the blessings that I have alongside of all the other ones.
Well, Rashid Johnson, you have blessed us by, first of all, your artistry, by your just creative genius, and with the production of this very special book that gives us some insight into how you think, how you create, how you deal with the complexity of life as an artist. So thank you. Please join me in thanking Rashid Johnson. So we've got more to drink and eat outside, and get a book.